What would you do if you discovered that the charming men who married the widows in your town were not who they claimed to be? That beneath their identical smiles lay a conspiracy so calculated it spanned generations? In the harsh winter of 1895, as Oklahoma Territory struggled through its sixth year since the land run, a peculiar pattern began emerging across the newly settled farmlands of what would later become Blackwood County. A pattern that local authorities would dismiss as coincidence until the evidence became too gruesome to ignore. The first documented case appeared in the records of the Territorial Marshal's Office on January 23, 1895. Martha Ellicott, a widow of 43 years whose husband had perished in a threshing accident the previous autumn, reported to Deputy Marshal Franklin Howe that her new husband of just 3 months, Theodore Blackwood, had vanished without a trace, along with the deed to her 160-acre homestead. "I knew it was quick to remarry," Martha told the deputy, according to his written account. "But winter is cruel to a woman alone, and Theodore was so attentive, so understanding of my grief. He said he'd lost his own wife back in Missouri, said he knew exactly what I was feeling." The deputy recorded the complaint, but took little action. Men abandoning wives was hardly uncommon in the territories, and the marshal's office had more pressing concerns with cattle rustling and land disputes turning violent across the county lines. What no one realized at the time was that Theodore Blackwood would be the first thread in unraveling a tapestry of horror that had been meticulously woven across the Oklahoma plains. 3 weeks later, on February 17th, Wilma Dougherty from the neighboring township of Elgin reported that her husband of 5 months, Thomas Blackwood, had similarly disappeared with her property deed after a brief courtship following her first husband's death from typhoid fever. The similarities in the cases might have raised alarms had the complaints not been filed in different jurisdictions. It would take 3 more such reports before anyone began connecting these seemingly isolated incidents. By April of 1895, 5 widows across what is now central Oklahoma had reported nearly identical stories. They had been courted and married by charming, well-spoken men who identified themselves as recent widowers, only to have these men disappear with their property deeds shortly after the marriage was consummated. The territorial governor's office finally took notice when the 5th widow, Eleanor Pritchett, reported not only the theft of her deed, but also that her husband had made disturbing alterations to her root cellar in the weeks before his disappearance. "He spent hours down there," Eleanor stated in her affidavit to territorial investigator James Rutherford. "Said he was making improvements, building storage shelves for the winter preserves. But the night before he vanished, I heard such strange sounds coming from below, like someone whispering, only it wasn't words, more like singing, but not any tune I ever heard. When I went to investigate after he left, I found strange markings carved into the support beams, shapes that made my eyes hurt to look upon them." Rutherford's initial investigation revealed the first truly disturbing element of what would become known in hushed whispers as the Blackwood affair. The 5 men who had married and defrauded these widows all shared the same surname and, according to descriptions, bore striking physical resemblances to one another. Yet none had records of birth or previous residence in any of the territories or neighboring states. It was Eleanor Pritchett's root cellar, however, that provided the first physical evidence that something far more sinister than fraud was occurring. Rutherford's official report, filed on April 29, 1895, described markings reminiscent of ancient runic languages carved into the wooden beams. More disturbing was his discovery of a small hidden chamber dug beneath the dirt floor, containing what appeared to be human hair and nail clippings from the widow Pritchett, wrapped in cloth and labeled in an unfamiliar script. "I cannot reconcile these findings with any known criminal methodology," Rutherford wrote in his confidential report to the governor. "These appear to be ritual objects of some unknown purpose, rather than mere instruments of fraud. The investigation might have ended there, written off as the bizarre behavior of an organized band of confidence men, had Territorial Marshal William Grady not recognized similarities to an unsolved case from eastern Kansas some 20 years earlier. His telegram to the Topeka authorities resulted in the arrival of a dusty case file that would cast the Blackwood incidents in an altogether more horrifying light. The Kansas file, dated 1875, detailed a series of nearly identical incidents, widows remarried to charming strangers who subsequently disappeared with land deeds. In these cases, however, the investigation had progressed further. 3 bodies had been discovered on an abandoned farmstead outside Dodge City, all men matching the description of the missing husbands. All 3 bore the same face, down to identical moles and scars, and all 3 had been surgically altered, with evidence of extensive facial reconstruction. Most disturbing of all was the Kansas investigators' discovery of documentation indicating these men were not, as first assumed, identical triplets, but individuals who had been deliberately altered to resemble one another through a series of surgical procedures performed by someone with considerable medical skill, but questionable anatomical understanding. The cutting appears methodical, but follows no recognized medical procedure, wrote Dr. Lawrence Holcomb, the physician who examined the bodies in 1875. The facial musculature has been reshaped using techniques I cannot identify. Most disturbing are the palatal modifications and vocal cord adjustments that would render the subject's voices identical. This represents medical knowledge far beyond current capabilities, applied with a disregard for human dignity that I find abhorrent. The Kansas file included a single piece of evidence that would prove crucial, a daguerreotype showing a stern-faced couple standing behind 2 identical young boys, approximately 5 years of age. Written on the back in faded ink was, "The Blackwood Twins with guardians Edgar and Millicent Thorne, 1852. With this new information, Marshal Grady expanded his investigation beyond the defrauded widows. He dispatched deputies to trace land transfers across the territory over the previous decade. The pattern that emerged was as clear as it was disturbing. 23 properties previously owned by widows had been transferred to various corporate entities, all of which, when traced through territorial records, led back to a single holding company, Thorne Agricultural Enterprises, registered in 1887 to one Edgar Thorne, Jr. On May 15, 1895, Marshal Grady led a 6-man posse to the Thorne estate, a sprawling property located in the remote northwestern corner of the territory. What they found there would become the substance of nightmares for all involved, and would be largely redacted from official territorial records by order of the governor himself. The Thorne estate, according to surviving fragments of the marshal's report, consisted of a main house built in the grand plantation style uncommon to the territory, surrounded by several outbuildings, including a large barn that had been converted for purposes inconsistent with animal husbandry or grain storage. The estate appeared deserted upon their arrival, with no sign of recent habitation in the main house. It was in the converted barn that the true horror of the Blackwood operation was revealed. The building had been transformed into what Grady described as a theater of medical abomination. One half contained surgical equipment arranged around several operating tables, alongside cabinets filled with pharmaceuticals, anatomical texts, and surgical instruments of both recognized and unidentifiable design. The other half of the barn had been divided into cells, 12 in total, each containing a cot, chamber pot, and small writing desk. 6 of the cells stood empty. The other 6 contained occupants whose discovery caused Deputy Marshal Hawkins to resign from service immediately upon return to the territorial capital. The men in those cells, Grady wrote in his personal journal, later donated to the Oklahoma Historical Society by his widow, were in various stages of transformation. Some had their faces wrapped in bloody bandages, others displayed features partially altered to match what I now recognize as the Blackwood countenance. One unfortunate soul, further along in the process than the others, looked up at me with swollen, recently stitched features and said, in a voice made hollow by some procedure performed on his throat, "Am I ready to be a brother yet?" The most disturbing discovery, however, came from the ledgers found in what appeared to be Edgar Thorne's office adjacent to the surgical area. These detailed the recruitment and conditioning of men to become Blackwoods. The subjects were primarily drifters, alcoholics, and indigent individuals who would not be missed, men desperate enough to submit to surgical alteration and psychological conditioning in exchange for promises of wealth and purpose. The ledgers revealed a process far more systematic and extensive than the authorities had imagined. Entries dating back to 1870 documented the production of more than 30 Blackwoods over 2 decades. Each man was surgically altered to match an exacting physical template, then trained in specific behaviors and mannerisms. They were taught to target recently widowed women who had inherited farmland. using a meticulously developed method of courtship designed to exploit grief and loneliness. Most chilling were Thorne's notes on what he called the final phase of each operation. After securing property transfers, the Blackwoods were instructed to prepare ritual spaces in their new homes, typically root cellars or outbuildings, before returning to the Thorne estate for reprocessing. Subject 27 returned after successful acquisition of the Pritchett property, read one of the final entries, dated April 1895. Preparation of the ritual space was completed according to specifications, with the necessary sympathetic materials collected. Subject has fulfilled his purpose and will be transitioned to feed the greater work. The incubation chambers require fresh material, and the twins grow hungry for renewal. The reference to twins sparked a new line of investigation. The posse discovered a locked door in the main house, leading to a sub-basement that did not appear on any of the building's architectural plans. What they found inside defied rational explanation and drove Deputy Johnson to take his own life 3 weeks after the raid. Marshal Grady's official report on this discovery was immediately classified by the territorial governor and reportedly forwarded to officials in Washington. However, portions of his personal journal, written in increasingly unsteady handwriting, provide some insight into what the posse encountered. The chamber beneath the house defied all natural principles. 2 entities resided there, suspended in glass cylinders filled with a fluid none of us could identify. They resembled men only in the most basic outline. Their features bore some resemblance to the Blackwood template, but distorted as if viewed through rippling water. Dr. Ashton, who accompanied our party, suggested they might be the original Blackwood twins, somehow preserved beyond their natural lifespan through means he could not or would not speculate upon. Most disturbing was their apparent awareness of our presence. Though suspended in fluid with no visible means of respiration, both entities turned to track our movements through the room. When Hawkins approached one of the cylinders, the thing inside pressed a distended hand against the glass and, God help me, smiled with too many teeth. The notebooks found in this chamber were written in a script that alternated between recognizable English and something else entirely. The English portion suggested that Edgar and Millicent Thorne were not the twins' guardians, as we had assumed, but their caretakers, individuals who had discovered the twins in 1850 and recognized their potential. The nature of this potential was obliquely referenced in passages describing a hunger for essence and consumption of identity. The twins apparently required regular feedings derived from individuals who had been made to match their original appearance. The final pages we could decipher indicated that the twins were approaching what Thorne called the transcendence threshold, requiring a more concentrated form of feeding to achieve the great work. This phase of their plan apparently necessitated the simultaneous preparation of multiple properties according to specific ritual guidelines, forming what one passage described as a geometric harmony across the territory. I cannot bring myself to describe the preserved human remains we found in the chamber's far section, nor the uses to which they had apparently been put. The process of creating Blackwoods was not merely for the acquisition of land, but to prepare suitable vessels for some form of consumption. I have requested that the governor order the entire property burned to its foundations, though I fear that fire alone may be insufficient to cleanse what we have discovered. The Thorne estate was indeed burned on May 20th, 1895, by order of the territorial governor. The official explanation, published in the Oklahoma Herald, cited an outbreak of anthrax requiring complete destruction of the property. No mention was made of Edgar Thorne Jr., the glass chambers, or the entities contained within them. The 6 surviving Blackwoods discovered in the cells were transported under guard to the territorial asylum at Fort Supply, where they were kept in isolation. Within 2 weeks, all 6 were dead. The asylum superintendent's report cited acute melancholia leading to self-termination, as the cause, though later testimony from a night attendant suggested that all 6 men, despite being housed in separate secure rooms, had somehow managed to inflict identical wounds upon themselves at precisely the same moment, shortly after midnight on June 6th. The widows who had been victimized by the Blackwoods were reunited with their property deeds, which were discovered in a locked cabinet in Thorne's office. Most sold their farms and left the territory altogether. Those who remained reported recurring nightmares of identical men standing in their fields at dusk, all facing the direction of the burned Thorn estate. Marshal Grady led one final expedition related to the case in late June 1895. Based on calculations derived from the ritual preparations documented in Thorn's notebooks, he identified what he believed to be the center point of the geometric harmony the twins had been attempting to create. At these coordinates, approximately 20 miles northwest of the Thorn estate, the posse discovered a sinkhole that had recently formed, revealing a cavern system that showed evidence of human modification dating back several decades. The cavern walls bore carved symbols matching those found in the widow's root cellars, but on a vastly larger scale. At the center of the main chamber, a stone altar had been erected, surrounded by channels carved into the rock floor. Grady's journal describes the scene. The altar stone bears no relation to the surrounding geological formation. Dr. Ashton believes it to be meteoritic in origin, containing high concentrations of iron and other metals that cause compass needles to spin uselessly in its vicinity. The channels radiating from it form a pattern that, when sketched and viewed from above, creates an unmistakable representation of the Oklahoma Territory, with smaller marks indicating precisely where each of the Blackwood victims' properties was located. Most troubling is the evidence that something, has visited this site since our raid on the Thorn estate. Fresh markings have been added to the stone, and Dr. Ashton discovered 2 partial footprints in the soft clay near the altar. The prints, if indeed they are such, do not match any known boot or shoe, having only 3 distinct pressure points arranged in a triangular pattern. I have ordered the cavern entrance collapsed and the location to be struck from all official maps of the territory. Let God forgive me if I have merely entombed something that should have been destroyed, but we lack the means or understanding to do more. Marshal Grady resigned his position in October 1895, citing health concerns. He and his wife relocated to California, where he died of nervous exhaustion in 1902. His final journal entry, dated 3 days before his death, contains a single line. I saw 2 identical men standing outside my window last night, their faces half-formed and hungry. They are still looking for something they lost. The Blackwood case was officially closed in November 1895. All files related to the investigation were sealed by executive order of the territorial governor and reportedly transferred to Washington. No public acknowledgement of the case was ever made, and within a year most of the officials involved had either left government service or been reassigned to distant posts. In 1917, a survey team mapping water tables in what had by then become Blackwood County, renamed from its original designation in 1907 through a process that county records oddly failed to document, reported unusual ground subsidence in the northwestern region. Their equipment detected what appeared to be a large cavern system that did not appear on any geological surveys. When they attempted to investigate, 3 team members disappeared. The remaining surveyors reported hearing voices in unison, speaking words that hurt the mind, emanating from a narrow fissure in the earth. The U.S. Geological Survey dispatched a specialized team to investigate, but their findings were immediately classified. The entire area was subsequently designated a military testing ground and fenced off from public access, despite being nearly 100 miles from the nearest military installation. In 1943, during the height of World War II, the military testing ground designation was quietly removed, and the land was sold to Thorn Agricultural Industries, a corporate entity with no clear connection to the original Thorn family, but whose company letterhead bore a subtle design reminiscent of the symbols found in the cavern chamber 48 years earlier. Land records indicate that Thorn Agricultural Industries has, over the decades since, systematically acquired properties throughout Oklahoma in a pattern that, if plotted on a map, bears an uncomfortable resemblance to the channel design found in the cavern altar. More disturbing are the occasional reports from rural communities throughout the state of charming identical twins who appear briefly as agricultural consultants, land surveyors, or prospective buyers, always expressing particular interest in properties owned by recently widowed farmers. These reports are never investigated for long, and those who press the issue often find themselves facing unexpected tax audits, insurance complications, or other bureaucratic harassments until they abandon their inquiries. A former archivist with the Oklahoma Historical Society, who requested anonymity when interviewed in 1978, claimed that all official records relating to the original Blackwood case had been removed from state archives sometime in the 1950s by individuals claiming federal authority. The only surviving documentation exists in fragments of personal correspondence and journals kept by those peripherally involved, and in the whispered stories passed down through generations of rural Oklahomans who warn their widowed neighbors to beware of charming men who arrive bearing too perfect smiles and promises of companionship. Perhaps most unsettling is the phenomenon reported by elderly residents of Blackwood County regarding the former Thorne estate. Though nothing remains of the original structures, and the land has lain fallow for more than a century, locals insist that on certain nights, particularly during the spring equinox, two figures can be seen walking the perimeter of the property. They move in perfect synchronization, their features indistinct except for their smiles, which one witness described as too wide and filled with teeth like polished stone. These sightings are invariably followed by reports of strangers appearing in nearby communities, identical men with impeccable manners who express great interest in local widows. By the time anyone connects these appearances to the old legends, the men have vanished, often taking with them both widows and land deeds. In 2008, a doctoral student in cultural anthropology at Oklahoma State University began researching these stories for her dissertation on folklore and land ownership patterns in early Oklahoma. 6 months into her research, she abruptly abandoned the project and left the university. Her academic advisor received a single postcard from her, postmarked from New Zealand, containing only the words, "They're still hungry, still searching for what they lost. The work never stopped." The most recent documented incident occurred in 2015, when Sheriff Danielle Martinez of Blackwood County received reports of identical twin men visiting recently widowed farmers throughout the county. By the time her deputies investigated, the men had vanished. 3 widows went missing that same month, their properties sold through power of attorney to various corporate subsidiaries that, when traced through labyrinthine legal filings, all connected to a holding company called Thorne Regenerative Technologies. When Sheriff Martinez attempted to investigate further, she was informed by federal authorities that the matter had been taken out of her jurisdiction. Her subsequent requests for information under the Freedom of Information Act have all been denied on grounds of national security. The location of the cavern system discovered by Marshall Grady in 1895 remains classified. Satellite imagery of the region shows a perfectly circular area of 20 miles diameter where imaging data appears distorted or corrupted. Official explanations cite equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference, but independent analysts have noted that the distortion forms a pattern similar to the symbols described in Grady's journal. Whatever became of the entities known as the Blackwood Twins, whether they were destroyed in the fire that consumed the Thorne estate, whether they somehow escaped, or whether they were merely manifestations of something older and more deeply rooted in the land itself, remains unknown. But throughout rural Oklahoma, farmers still paint their root cellar doors with symbols said to ward off twin strangers, and widows are still warned by concerned neighbors to beware of charming men who appear too suddenly after funerals, bearing identical smiles and promises of comfort. What would you do if you discovered that beneath the soil of your town lies evidence of a ritual so vast it encompasses an entire state? That the very ground you walk upon has been measured, marked, and prepared for a purpose beyond human comprehension? In the wake of the Blackwood discoveries of 1895, as documented in the previous section, territorial authorities believed they had ended the macabre operations of the Thorne family and their manufactured twins. They were gravely mistaken. Historical records indicate that following the official closure of the Blackwood case, a period of unusual calm settled over the territory. Land transactions proceeded normally, widowed farmers remarried without incident, and the strange occurrences that had plagued the region seemed to have ceased. This peace would prove illusory. The first indication that something remained deeply wrong came in February 1897, when homesteader Jacob Mercer discovered peculiar formations while digging a new well on his property 50 miles east of the former Thorne estate. According to his correspondence with a former territorial deputy, preserved in the University of Oklahoma's folklore collection, Mercer uncovered a layer of soil that didn't belong. "There's a stratum about 12 feet down," Mercer wrote, "that contains material I cannot identify. Black granules mixed with a reddish substance that feels like sand, but behaves like liquid when disturbed. Most peculiar is how this layer forms a perfect circle, exactly 6 feet in diameter, as if it had been deliberately placed. The soil above and below shows no disturbance, suggesting this material has been here since long before settlement. Mercer reported his findings to county authorities, who dismissed his concerns as an unusual but natural geological formation. Frustrated, Mercer continued his investigation privately, contacting other farmers and encouraging them to examine their own wells and root cellars. Within 6 months, he had documented 17 similar formations across 3 counties, all at the same depth, all the same diameter. When plotted on a map, these formations created a pattern identical to one of the symbols found in the cavern altar during Marshal Grady's final expedition. On October 3, 1897, Jacob Mercer disappeared from his homestead. His wife reported that he had been visited the previous day by government surveyors, identical twin men who expressed interest in his well-digging techniques. A search of Mercer's home revealed that his maps and documentation had vanished along with him. The case was briefly investigated as a possible murder, but without evidence or a body, it was eventually abandoned. Mercer's disappearance might have remained an isolated incident had a land assessor named Howard Phillips not stumbled upon the farmer's original notes, which Mercer had prudently mailed to his brother in Kansas shortly before his disappearance. Phillips, who had served briefly as a clerk in the Territorial Marshal's office during the original Blackwood investigation, recognized the significance of the pattern Mercer had documented. In a confidential letter to former Marshal Grady, dated April 1898, Phillips wrote, "The formations Mercer discovered are not random, nor are they the result of natural processes. They form a perfect replication of the anchoring sigil you described finding in the cavern altar. More disturbing is my discovery that each of these sites corresponds to a property that was, at some point, owned by a Blackwood victim. This suggests the twins' operation was far more extensive than we initially believed, and that the land seizures were not merely for financial gain, but part of some larger design that remains in progress despite our intervention." Phillips requested Grady's assistance in bringing this information to federal authorities, but received no response. 3 weeks later, Phillips' home was destroyed in what official reports described as a coal stove accident. His body was never recovered from the ashes, which witnesses described as unusually dark and oily. For nearly 2 decades following these events, no official acknowledgement of ongoing Blackwood activity appears in any government records. However, a pattern emerges in local newspaper archives from this period. Sporadic reports of identical twins passing through small communities, always in association with land sales or property transfers involving widowed farmers. The most significant development came during the land rush that followed Oklahoma's admission to statehood in 1907. As settlers flooded into newly opened territories, the Oklahoma Land Office was overwhelmed with claims and transfers. In this chaos, few noticed that a disproportionate number of prime agricultural properties were being purchased by corporate entities with virtually identical legal structures, all ultimately controlled by a holding company called Thorne Generational Holdings. This pattern might have continued undetected had it not been for the diligence of Land Office clerk Abigail Winters, who noticed the recurring corporate structures while processing claim documents. Her suspicions aroused, Winters began tracking these transactions, creating a detailed map of properties acquired by Thorne-affiliated entities. In her personal diary, recovered after her death in 1922, Winters wrote, "The pattern becomes unmistakable when viewed from above. The Thorne acquisitions form a vast geometric design across the state, centered on what was once their family estate. Each property serves as a node in this design, connected by invisible lines of force that I can almost perceive when studying my maps for too long. I dream of these patterns now, great spirals of land and blood, feeding something ancient and patient, something that waits beneath the soil of our young state." Winters apparently shared her concerns with her supervisor, who granted her a leave of absence for nervous exhaustion in November 1910. Upon her return 3 months later, she discovered that her maps and documentation had been removed from her office. When she attempted to recreate her work, she found that many of the relevant land records had been altered or removed from the archives. Frustrated but undeterred, Winters continued her investigation privately, traveling throughout the state to examine county records and speak with local residents about land ownership patterns. Her diary entries from this period grow increasingly disturbed, describing identical men watching from a distance and dreams of twins speaking in unison from glass chambers filled with fluid. On May 17, 1911, Winters wrote her final diary entry, "They found me. Two men with perfect faces and empty eyes came to my boarding house today. They spoke with my landlady for several minutes, their voices so precisely matched that they seemed to emanate from a single throat. When I returned from the archive, Mrs. Halloran told me that my cousins had called and were eager to reunite. I have no cousins. I've barricaded my door, but I know it won't hold. The twins are hungry again, seeking what they lost. The great work continues." Abigail Winters' body was discovered 3 days later. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by poisoning, though the coroner's report noted several unusual aspects of the case, including the presence of an unidentified black residue under her fingernails and the fact that her eyes had apparently changed color at the time of death. With Winters' death, official investigation into Thorne-related activities effectively ceased for several decades. However, local folklore continued to accumulate stories of the identical men who appeared in rural communities during times of hardship, particularly during the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s, when desperate farmers were often forced to sell their land for a fraction of its value. A significant development occurred in 1942 when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began construction of a reservoir in northwestern Oklahoma. During excavation, workers uncovered an extensive tunnel system that did not appear on any geological survey. According to a classified report later leaked to researchers at the University of Tulsa, the tunnels contained evidence of both Native American occupation dating back centuries and more recent modifications, consistent with the ritual spaces described in the original Blackwood case. Most disturbing was the discovery of a chamber nearly 500 feet below the surface, containing 2 empty glass cylinders of a design matching those described in Marshall Grady's journal. Surrounding these cylinders were dozens of human remains, all bearing evidence of extensive surgical modification to their facial structures. All had been positioned in concentric circles around the cylinders, their heads oriented toward the center. The Corps of Engineers immediately halted construction and contacted military intelligence. Within 24 hours, the entire site was placed under military jurisdiction. The reservoir project was relocated, and the original site was designated a restricted area on grounds of unstable geological conditions. Civilian workers were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, and the entire incident was scrubbed from official records. Nevertheless, rumors persisted. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, residents of communities surrounding the restricted area reported unusual phenomena: lights emanating from supposedly abandoned mine shafts, the sound of chanting carried on the wind during moonless nights, and most frequently, sightings of identical twin men walking the perimeter of the restricted zone, always at dusk, always moving in perfect synchronization. Their findings, published in an obscure academic journal before being retracted under government pressure, described a network of tunnels extending far beyond the restricted area, forming a pattern that suggests deliberate design rather than natural formation. More significant was their discovery of what appeared to be chambers at regular intervals throughout the tunnel system, each positioned directly beneath properties that had, at some point in their history, been owned by Thorne-affiliated entities. These reports gained unexpected credibility in 1971, when a team from Oklahoma State University's Department of Geology obtained permission to conduct a ground-penetrating radar survey of areas adjacent to the restricted zone. The survey was abruptly terminated when the team's leader, Dr. Eliza Montague, reported being approached by government representatives, identical twin men who expressed concern about her research methodology. 2 weeks later, the university announced that Dr. Montague had accepted a research position abroad. Her colleagues received a single postcard, postmarked from Switzerland, but with no return address, containing only the message, "They're still here, still hungry. The great work continues." The most comprehensive attempt to investigate the Blackwood phenomenon came in 1985, when investigative journalist Michael Crawford began researching a book on historical land fraud in Oklahoma. Crawford, whose previous work had exposed corporate corruption in the oil industry, stumbled upon references to the original Blackwood case while examining patterns of land acquisition during the state's early development. Intrigued, Crawford spent 3 years tracking the Thorne corporate entities through decades of legal filings, property transfers, and corporate reorganizations. What he discovered was disturbing. Despite multiple name changes, restructurings, and apparent dissolutions, the original Thorne Holding Company had maintained control of specific properties throughout Oklahoma for over 90 years. More disturbing was the pattern these properties formed, a vast geometric design that, when viewed from above, created a symbol identical to those found in the cavern altar in 1895. In notes for his unfinished manuscript, found in his apartment after his disappearance in 1988, Crawford wrote, "The Thorne operation never ended. It merely evolved. What began as crude land seizures through fraudulent marriages has developed into a sophisticated network of corporate entities, all serving the same purpose: the acquisition and preparation of specific properties according to some arcane design. The Blackwoods still exist, though they've abandoned their original methodology. Now they operate through corporate structures, leveraging economic hardship instead of personal grief to acquire the land they need." Most disturbing is what happens to these properties after acquisition. Satellite imagery shows unusual soil discoloration in perfect circular patterns on each Thorne-controlled property, patterns identical to those Jacob Mercer discovered in 1897. Something is being systematically introduced into the soil at these locations, creating a network of nodes across the state that correspond exactly to the design found in the cavern altar. I've identified 127 such nodes thus far. If my calculations are correct, they need only 7 more to complete the pattern. What happens when the design is completed I cannot say, but the timing appears deliberate. According to the fragments of Thorne's journals that survived, the great work operates on a 150-year cycle that will reach completion in 2045. Crawford disappeared 3 days after writing these notes. His apartment showed no signs of struggle, but investigators noted a strange black residue on his desk and an unusual odor that one officer described as like electricity and rotting flowers. His research materials vanished along with him, and the case remains officially unsolved. In 2011, a graduate student named Sarah Chen discovered references to Crawford's work while researching corporate land ownership patterns for her economics dissertation. Intrigued, she began tracking down people who had known Crawford before his disappearance. Most refused to speak with her, but one former colleague shared copies of notes he had received from Crawford shortly before the journalist vanished. These notes contained coordinates for several properties Chen identified as current or former Thorne holdings. Using satellite imaging technology unavailable in Crawford's time, Chen discovered that each property contained perfect circular areas of altered soil composition, visible only in certain light spectrums. When mapped collectively, these circles formed a pattern matching the anchoring sigil described in historical accounts of the cavern altar. Chen presented her findings at an academic conference in 2013, framing them as an interesting case study in unusual corporate acquisition strategies. 3 weeks later, her apartment was destroyed in what authorities ruled an electrical fire. Chen survived, but suffered severe burns and apparent trauma-induced memory loss regarding her research. She currently resides in an assisted living facility, where she reportedly spends her days drawing circular patterns and whispering about the twins beneath. The most recent development in the Blackwood saga occurred in 2021, when severe flooding in northwestern Oklahoma caused a partial collapse in the long-restricted area surrounding the original excavation site. Emergency response teams reported discovering a network of tunnels exposed by the collapse, containing evidence of recent human activity, despite the area having been officially abandoned for decades. Before a full investigation could be conducted, federal authorities assumed jurisdiction, citing concerns about unstable geological conditions and potential environmental contaminants. The site was immediately sealed, and emergency responders were required to sign non-disclosure agreements under the pretense of national security concerns. However, one responder who requested anonymity when interviewed described seeing chambers filled with modern surgical equipment and glass cylinders large enough to hold human beings filled with a cloudy fluid. Most disturbing was his claim of hearing Two voices speaking in perfect unison from somewhere deep in the tunnel system, reciting what sounded like coordinates or measurements. Land records indicate that in the months following this incident, 7 agricultural properties across Oklahoma were acquired by various corporate entities, all ultimately controlled by a recently formed holding company called Thorn Regenerative Solutions. These 7 properties correspond exactly to the final nodes Crawford identified as necessary to complete the vast geometric pattern spanning the state. Construction permits filed with county authorities show that each property is scheduled for agricultural infrastructure development in 2045, exactly 150 years after the original discovery of the Blackwood operation and the date Crawford identified as the completion of the cycle. What awaits when this cycle completes remains unknown. The entities encountered in the glass cylinders beneath the Thorn estate in 1895, whether they were truly the original Blackwood twins, somehow preserved beyond natural life, or something older that had merely adopted their form, appear to operate on a timescale and toward purposes beyond ordinary human comprehension. Yet throughout rural Oklahoma, awareness of the Blackwood legacy persists in folklore and whispered warnings. Farmers still avoid digging wells in perfect circles. Widows are still cautioned against charming twin strangers who appear too soon after funerals, and the name Thorn on corporate letterhead still causes unease among those who remember the old stories. Perhaps most telling is the fact that Blackwood County consistently reports the state's lowest rate of land turnover, with family farms passing from generation to generation despite economic pressures that have forced consolidation elsewhere. When asked why they refuse lucrative offers from corporate buyers, elderly farmers often give the same response. Some lands shouldn't change hands. Some soil shouldn't be disturbed. Meanwhile, satellite imagery continues to show a perfectly circular area of 20 miles diameter in northwestern Oklahoma, where data appears corrupted or distorted. Official explanations cite equipment malfunction, but independent analysts note that the distortion forms a pattern matching the symbols described in historical accounts of the cavern altar. And throughout the state, in small farming communities and remote rural areas, residents occasionally report sightings of identical twin men walking through recently harvested fields at dusk, moving in perfect synchronization, their faces turned toward the earth as if listening for something stirring beneath the soil. The twins are still hungry, still searching for what they lost.